Howdy once again. Well, I've watched your video a total of one time, so I probably should have watched it multiple times in order to get a lot of the nuances, but there are a couple of quick points that I wanted to make. Firstly, I think the whole notion of rights, and this is something which I said previously, but I'll restate, the whole notion of rights are only beneficial if you can, get them. The whole notion of posthumous rights may be useful to your family, but basically, if you engage in any kind of confrontation where you lose your life, then the whole notion of you having rights is in some regard negated. You basically said that the views with regards to the libertarian movement are equivalent to fundamentalist religion. And I think you probably need to review your video in this sense. The whole notion of the contract with regards to the sacred texts is analogous to what religious folks say about, a particular group of religious folks say about homosexuality, for example. So I think this whole notion of contracts and these kind of things is, again, completely removed from what I talked about originally, which is the nature of the US legal system, which you kind of skirt around by not really talking about and just saying that, libertarians hold this belief. Now, you do make another really important point, and I stand before you as someone who has actually moved based on laws which I thought were grossly unfair in my home country. And as someone who has actually moved, as someone who has moved to not one but two countries through this process, I do really understand what you're saying there. However, as someone who has done that, I take no comfort in the fact that none of the... I've heard of one libertarian fellow who moved to Canada for a very short period of time and then moved back to the US. But I've heard no other accounts of libertarians that have actually left the US. And I think this is an important point, because if you say you're going to do something and you don't actually do it, then really you're not saying anything except reassuring yourself. And I think particularly with regards to the whole notion that realistically you're sympathetic to the folks in Waco and Ruby Ridge indicates that you probably, if you want to enact your beliefs, will get into a similar kind of situation, which returns to this whole notion of there's no such thing as posthumous rights. But what I will say as someone who has moved repeatedly is that there is a huge amount of cost and forethought and general thinking involved, but it is probably better to live your life as an honest citizen rather than someone who says things without actually acting out on them. So in this regard, because particularly with regards to discourse on open carry, the reduction of open carry, and probably the continued reduction of perceived libertarian rights in the US, I think you should seriously consider where you're going to move to, which country you're going to move to specifically. And this itself produces a paradox, because I think the US is probably the closest to a libertarian state that you could find, aside from finding a bit of land in Somalia or Afghanistan or somewhere where you could create your own kind of isolated compound. There are parts of the US where you could do that as well, but you would still come under the same kind of problems that the folks at Waco and Ruby Ridge encountered. So, really, if you want to follow this whole intellectual movement through, then you shouldn't make idle threats. I think the whole nature of this is, if you want to move to another country, find another country. I like your idea of taking over other countries. I think that's, more power to you in that direction. But it just strikes me as strange that these things are made as, possibilities, idle threats, but not actually acted upon. In my previous video, you'll see that I make note of that people that have views, extreme views, talk about their views constantly, but don't actually act upon them. To me, that's equally meaningless. So I think you've kind of set out your own view. The notion of being a law-abiding citizen is one thing, but I think you should seriously consider which country you'd move to and what benefits you'd find in the countries that you move to. And if you can't play that through, as I've never found a libertarian who could actually leave the US for any length of time without actually returning to the US, you then need to start thinking about the kind of social contract that you have as an individual within the society in the context of your belief system. And similar to a lot of folks who I've encountered who have been part of fundamentalist religions, the way you probably do this is similar to the folks at Waco. You form tight social networks and you live amongst yourselves in some regard. But this really goes against the whole notion of kind of open intellectual discourse. So I guess you've answered my question in some regard. You've reinforced a number of my concerns with regards to your views, and I hope my thoughts with regards to particularly moving to other countries do resonate with you in some regard. So certainly, I'm interested in hearing which countries you'd want to move to, and I'm certainly, more power to you, because I have a lot more respect for folks who actually do what they say as opposed to say a lot. And I've lived my life doing what I say. So, Tom Barberland, Las Vegas, Nevada, signing out.